Law enforcement officers of Reddit, is there an arrest in your career that broke your heart to make, but it was your duty to make it? I had to arrest a juvenile who was on probation. The kid had to obey his mother's orders. She called us because he was refusing to sleep on the kitchen floor. His mother literally was attempting to punish him by making him sleep on the linoleum floor. She was a pill-popping junkie who was unfit to be a parent. I had to call the kid's probation officer, PO, and the PO wanted the kid lodged in the county juvenile detention facility. I was fucking pissed off. This occurred the week before Christmas. While I was transporting the kid to jail, I asked him what he wanted for Christmas. He told me, "I just want to be happy." I asked him what he liked to do for a hobby. He told me he played a lot of basketball in the park across from his apartment building, but his mom took his ball away. My partner and I bought the kid a good Spalding basketball for Christmas, and he told us he never knew cops could be so nice. I think about this kid all the time, even though he has moved away to live with a grandparent. I consider this to be one of the best things I have done in my career. This happened 6 years ago. I posted this story in another link a while ago, but figured I share it again. It made such an impact in my career. About 3 years ago I got a call from a man who was concerned about his friend. He wanted us to go with him and a local mental health group to check on him at his apartment. I'll call this man John. The caller, myself, and the mobile mental health workers met us at John's apartment, if I would even call it an apartment. It was a basement apartment with 2 small windows looking out to bring light into the tiny living room. The place was pretty Spartan except for a bed, a kitchen table with no chairs, a couch, and a small coffee table with a 3-inch thick journal that was completely filled up with John's writing on the front and back of every page. I quickly learned that John was a Marine and had very recently returned from a 2-year tour in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those 2 years completely and utterly fucked him up. He knew basically why we were there and admitted that he wanted to just kill himself, but was not brave enough to do it. He went on to tell me about how he had to kill men, women, and children while he was at war and read some pages for me out of his journal. I won't write what he read to me, but they were the deepest and most heartbreaking words I have ever heard read out loud. I learned that after he was at the end of his tour, he was shipped to Italy to await his trip home and tried to kill himself. He was placed in a mental facility that he described as something out of a horror movie. Once he finally got home, the Marines gave him his honorable discharge and booted him out without another word. It took every ounce of strength I had to not cry. It took a long time and a scary moment where I thought he was going to fight us, but we were able to convince him to go get real help. I told him we could call him an ambulance to bring him to the hospital, because if I drove him, my department rules stated I would have to handcuff him. He didn't have insurance, so I was forced to take him in handcuffs. He got in the back of the police car and started to cry quietly to himself. I broke down at that point. When we got to the hospital I took him out, uncuffed him, and hugged him. He broke down into violent sobs in my arms and we ended up on the ground just crying and holding each other. What did I learn from this one call? That the military and America failed this man. They sent him to war, offered no help when he needed it, and then booted him out into the world. Flash forward 2 more years, John is 100% better. He was transferred to a VA hospital and got the real treatment he needed. I happened to pull over his friend who made the call for speeding, and he told me how John had made a complete change and was so much better. It was the best ending I could have imagined for the worst call I've ever been to. My father was friends in high school with a guy who was once a police officer but later resigned. He was forced to shoot a pregnant woman because she was firing a weapon towards him. Her husband had drugged her earlier that night in hopes of killing the child, but called 911 when she became violent and threatened to shoot him. The meds caused her to hallucinate, and she used the gun on the officer who arrived at the scene. When I was a kid, my dad was a huge druggie. One night he came home, after being gone for several days on a binge. He was completely stoned and wasted, and from what I remember, he was also in possession of coke, so my mom calls the cops and they come to get him. I remember I was crying and yelling, because I didn't want them to take my dad away, so one of the cops come up to me to try to calm me down, and I remember telling him that I hated him, and I just wanted him to leave me alone. I can still see the dejected look on his face. I feel so bad about that now, because I know how much of a piece of shit my dad is, and how nice it was of that officer to try and calm little 6-year-old me down. I'm not law enforcement, but the cops in my town had to arrest my mom on Christmas morning. I was 17 and my dad was already in prison. They knocked on the door and she went with them with no fight. They didn't contact anyone because of my age, so I was completely alone on Christmas. The arresting officer came back to my front door with tears coming down his face. He told me what was going to happen and what they arrested her for: embezzlement. I could tell the man's heart was broken. He kept apologizing, saying that it was just his job and he was so sorry. It turns out the whole 4 years she was in jail, that officer would look out for me triple time due to the fact that my mom's abusive ex was after me. He is probably one of the best cops I've ever met. I'm grateful that he was the man that arrested her. He also arrested her ex when he broke into my house 2 weeks after. He set me up with a PFA and looked out for me. He changed my view on police completely. I talked to an officer that had to arrest an 8-month pregnant mother of 3 after she slapped her husband. The husband spent the family's money on booze and other women, leaving his family in an impoverished state to the point that the mother was using newspapers as diapers for her youngest children. When the wife slapped him, the husband called the cops and she spent the night in jail. The person who tested me for my driver's test told me this story. She works both jobs. A 19-year-old male got a 17-year-old pregnant. They absolutely adored each other and were the happiest couple and planned on raising the child. However, the girl's parents hated every aspect, so they called it rape and that he must be arrested. When the child was being born, the officer had to drag him away in cuffs moments before the child was born. 2 years into the arrest/trial, he never got to see his son. It ruined her to the point of which she needed to take time away from being a cop and needed a second job to keep up with payments. This was 4 years ago, and I really do wish I could have found her to hear the rest of the story. Very early on in my career, I went to a domestic. A husband and wife were on the outs and separating. They were arguing, and a neighbor called the police. During the argument, the husband takes their wedding photo, rips it in half, bride on one side, groom on the other, and hands half to the wife, saying, "Here's your half." In my jurisdiction, I have discretion over nearly every enforcement I want or don't want to take, except for domestic violence. Advocacy groups have forced the issue so hard that I get no discretion at all without placing my job at risk. By definition, the picture was communal property. Ripping it was criminal damage and thus a DV crime. The wife didn't want anything done, but in DV crimes, because of advocacy groups, the state assumes the role of the victim, and I was forced to arrest him. He spent the night in jail for ripping his own wedding picture because his marriage didn't work out. I understand why some domestic violence laws exist. We have pushed the umbrella so far to encompass things like ongoing sexual relationships or romantic relationships, and we have lowered the bar of what crimes are included. So now if a third party hears something they didn't like, and you and your boyfriend of 4 weeks were arguing, you can go to jail. People have forgotten that couples argue. Arguing is normal and healthy, but the hands of the officer have been bound by legislation. People are being arrested for losing their temper, raising their voice, and are taken out in handcuffs in front of their spouse, kids, and neighbors. Those arrests never sit right with me. Back when I worked in the legal aid office in our local district court, I had an old lady, 70 plus, knocking at my door on a Friday afternoon. She said that she was late with her payment of a penalty order and wanted to know what to do. It looked like she got used by some of her relatives in connection with fraud. She got a wrist slap in form of a penalty order and was supposed to pay the fine in monthly installments. Apparently she was late with some payments and asked if she could pay them once her retirement money was due next week. I did a routine check and found that she had an outstanding arrest warrant because of her missed payments. As it stood then, I was supposed to arrest her or give her the option to pay right then, but she had not enough money and no way to get her hands on enough on short notice. I tried to call the DA's office to ask if they could temporarily lift the warrant, but as it was Friday afternoon, no one was there. What that meant was that this 70-plus-year-old lady would now have to spend at least the weekend in jail. I called the police to have a transport ready to get her there, but when the police officer and I talked it through on the phone, we both came to the conclusion that we both did not want to send an old lady like that to jail for late payments that would be dealt with early next week, and that she never really was in my office that day in the first place. So it was my duty to arrest her, but I did not. My very first arrest. Here's the backstory. I'm fresh out of training, one of my first shifts on my own. I've been out patrolling, just trying to get a feel for my sector. I work in a major city in the Midwest. My dispatcher calls me for a domestic dispute in progress. I arrive and radio for another unit as I approach the area. Before I can even get to the door, a man comes out, bloody as all hell and just looking like a wreck. He starts telling me that his girlfriend hit him in the head with a baseball bat, and she did some serious damage. I was in disbelief that he was standing. I had him sit on the ground, and after I called for medical units, I went inside. Come to find out, this lady had been beaten by her boyfriend regularly for around the last 5 years, but she had never reported it. When he started yelling at her on that day, she had enough. She smoked him with the bat and he called the police. The boyfriend even confirmed that he had beat her before, but I couldn't do anything about it. I had to arrest the woman for domestic violence and I hated it. I was so angry it was almost unbelievable. I still think about if I could have done anything different, and have eventually. I just had to move on. TL. Doctor, I had to arrest a woman for basically defending herself from domestic violence. Not law enforcement, but I got a share. Several years back I had a lemon of a vehicle that had serious electrical problems I could not afford to fix. I was pulled over for an out headlamp, given a fix-it ticket. Got it fixed, but I was late for work, so the officer that checked it out said he'd take the ticket in and get it taken care of so I could get to work on time. Turns out he must not have, because it spiraled into the worst law situation of my life. Suspended license, driver responsibility fees, fuck Michigan, and general hell. Fast forward 2 or so years, and I'm still dealing with this situation. I'm paying Michigan close to $4,000 in fees, and trying to get my shit together in life. I'm pulled over for having an out tail light, and told my license is suspended for non-payment of fees to the state. The officer pulled me out of my vehicle and cuffed me, put me in the back of his cruiser. He told me I was being arrested for driving on a suspended license, multiple offenses. I broke down in the back of his car. 23-year-old man crying like this doesn't look good, so he asks me to explain what's going on. My mom had just lost her job, so I'd recently moved back home, and was working double to make her mortgage payments, and Michigan wouldn't accept the money I was sending them. Apparently, $50 every 2 weeks wasn't enough, so they'd suspended my license a third time without notifying me. I explained all of this to the officer through the tears. After sitting in the car for a few more minutes while he filled out some paperwork, he let me out of the back, uncuffed me, and told me to drive home while he followed. Once I got back to the house, he handed me a torn up ticket and $200. He told me to send it into Michigan and get back on a payment plan, and that he'd put a note on my file in the city's record that he'd given me 6 months to figure it all out, then wished me luck and drove away. Everything got sorted by the end of the year, and it was thanks to one officer's generosity and understanding. I wish I remembered his name, but he's a shining example of what law enforcers should be like. My first year as a solo officer, I responded to a medical call at a bar where a woman was having a seizure. I arrived shortly after medical units and found the victim's husband fighting medical staff. He was pretty intoxicated and trying to get to his wife. I tried talking to him and explaining that he had to back away so the medics could help her. I tried pulling him away, but the more I tried to calm him down, the more he fought me. Medical staff was having a great deal of trouble aiding his wife, and he was much larger than I. I'm a female officer and was in my early 20s at the time. I ended up having to engage him physically. He kicked and punched me, while I just tried to keep him occupied with fighting me, and not the medics. Other officers arrived, and together we were finally able to hold him down, so the medics were able to load up his wife. She passed away that night. The officer assigned the call chose to lodge the man in jail for resisting arrest. I protested but was ordered to place him in jail. He spent the night in jail while his wife was dying. All charges were later dropped, and the officer who made that decision was later fired for other reasons. I still feel terrible for having to be a part of what is sure to be the worst night of that man's life. I'm from the Yukon Territory in northern Canada. No, I don't live in an igloo or have a pet polar bear, but I wish I did, because a pet polar bear would be fucking awesome. And the cops are usually super cool. One night a cop pulled over because we were walking and drinking a beer. He lets us finish the beer and he took the cans after, since we were not near a trash can. Another time my buddy was being cheeky and asked a cop what would I have to do to get tasered. The cop replied something very stupid, to which my buddy thought about for a second then proceeded to slap the cop. The cop took the slap and calmly backhanded my buddy to ground and said, "You are a ballsy motherfucker, but I'm still not going to taser you." Probably the funniest thing I have seen. I'm not law enforcement, but I did work as a store detective for a high-ticket debt store. The Friday before the Mother's Day weekend I had to arrest a guy who got out of jail 36 hours before. He was stealing over $1,000 in clothes. When we searched his bags he had bought his mother a card and a dressing gown at another store. This one tore me up because of his mom. No matter what mistakes he had made, her son just spent 5 years inside and got out just in time for Mother's Day. I know she would have been excited that she could see her son on Mother's Day and now she wouldn't. I was so angry at him for doing that. He could have fronted up with nothing but prison fatigues and flowers he picked on the way and she would have been happy. Seriously, fuck that guy.